Hello, and welcome to this webinar on cybersecurity in the boardroom, presented by Corporate Secretary Magazine, along with our partner and sponsor for this event, Diligent Board Member Services. I'm Neil Stewart, Editorial and Research Director at Cross Border, the publisher of Corporate Secretary, and I'm your moderator today. As we go along, we do welcome questions from our live audience. Just type them into the question box on your webinar screen. Our speakers today, Jeff Powell is Executive Vice President of Sales North America for Diligent Board Member Services. Diligent's Board Books product is the world's most widely used board portal, and Jeff is responsible for the development and execution of client acquisition strategies throughout the Americas. Dan Stein is a partner in the Richards, Kibbe, and Orby litigation department with clients including financial institutions, hedge funds, corporations, investment bankers, attorneys, brokers, traders, and other investment professionals. Dan was formerly a federal prosecutor in New York. Now, this is going to be quite a quick webinar. We're going to cover a lot of ground in around 30 minutes. With Jeff, we're going to be focusing on the board's own cyber risk, but let's start by looking at the corporation as a whole. The rising threat to U.S. companies is well known. It's definitely a high priority for a lot of boards. Now, during this webinar, we'll be asking the audience a few polling questions. Right off the bat, we have some results from a question we asked in the registration point on the web. And the question was, does your board review security program assessments? Yes, 34% do. Sometimes, 27%. Rarely or never, 13%. Still rarely or never review. And don't know, 26%. So that's the state of play in terms of our audience listening. Now, Dan, I want to get you to give us a sense of the degree of risk, the current alert level for cybersecurity for companies. Give us a sense of the state of play.
Well, Neil, I think as everyone knows, the risk is hard to overstate. The annual cost is dramatic. The number of companies or the percentage of companies that are being affected by cyber attacks is substantial. We have on this slide a figure from 2011, which indicates that at that time, 90% of surveyed companies had detected security breaches. It's often said by cybersecurity experts that there are two categories of companies, those that have been breached and are aware of it, and those that have been breached and are not aware of it. And I think that to me is often a good indicator of where the magnitude of the risk is. I just have one reaction, Neil, to the survey data or the poll data that you presented. While there's still a high percentage of respondents who are not giving detailed information about what the board's preparedness is, I think those numbers are moving in the right direction compared to some surveys that have been put out in years past.
Good to know. Now, still talking about the threat level, Dan, in terms of the type of attacks and the targets, obviously we've seen retail companies like Target come under attack. We've seen financial institutions. Are there any trends in terms of the target, the profile of the target that companies should be aware of?
I think it would be a mistake to sort of look at who's been hit in the past and conclude from that some company is safe because there hasn't been this type of threat before. The attacks have occurred in all manner of industry and in all manner of different businesses. Whether it is something like the widely publicized attack on Target and Neiman Marcus, where there was consumer payment data stolen, or whether it is in some other industries things like a denial of service attack or business disruption or a cyber espionage incident, no matter what sort of business you're in, the risk exists and is real. And as comes up very often in our practice, the SEC and other financial regulators have made very clear that they're going to be focusing on this as an issue in the financial services sector, and I think it's fair to assume that other regulators are going to be doing the same.
Okay, so that said, risk across the board for companies. But let's just move on to this next slide. And obviously, retailers are especially high risk, or anybody uses payment systems, right?
Absolutely. Anyone who's relying on credit cards for payments or any kind of electronic communications for payments is in that business would be very much at risk. Although at the same time, that's really just one type of attack. If it's about theft of consumer payment data, any business that has a significant percentage of its value tied up in intellectual property, or is an innovative company, a web-based company that has source code, which is where most of the value is, those companies are at risk as well, because hackers can come in and steal that source code and render the business valueless overnight. So I would say any company that uses electronic payment services or any company that has a substantial amount of its value in intellectual property or computer code are particular companies that should be focused on this kind of risk.
Now, this slide that we're looking at, this Verizon Data Breach Investigations Report, this shows that it covers a lot of different industries, and there's just a lot of attacks going on these days, right?
Absolutely. All different types of attacks, whether it involves employee insider error or intrusions through point-of-sale systems or denial-of-service attacks or payment cards. There's really the breadth of attacks is as wide as criminals' imagination, which is quite broad.
Okay, so now just quickly, before we move on to how boards can prepare and how boards have to respond in the event of an attack, let's just briefly cover some of the consequences, some of the impacts on companies. Dan, what are some of the things particularly to note, especially when you're trying to maybe get directors to pay attention to these issues?
The risks, again, you don't want to sound too alarmist, but I think it's fair to say that the risks are risks to the enterprise. Something like what occurred with Target is obviously garnered tremendous national attention. It's clearly something that management in that company has to focus on, but it goes beyond even retailers who might see customers less willing to shop in their stores if they're afraid that their data is going to be stolen. Any business where there could be an interruption in its ability to conduct business, which would leave customers potentially unable to conclude transactions, would face a risk of liability from those customers who are unable to use systems because of a cyber attack. Any customers whose data is at risk could cause a serious consequence to the company, as companies like Wyndham have seen through regulatory action. There's I think you can break it down into headline and reputational risk, but also very real risk of loss of goodwill and business, as well as potential liability and exposure to customers whose interests are affected by an attack.
Okay, good. Thank you. Now, let's bring Jeff into the conversation here. And you can actually start to quantify some of this impact, right?
Yeah, you absolutely can. And, I mean, Dan made many excellent points. And, I mean, you see some figures here about the types of losses that, have been calculated based upon different surveys. But I do think it's important to understand, and just amplifying off what Dan was talking about, that it may seem obvious to people the types of cyber attacks, companies who are doing business, loss of customer data, that may seem obvious, but it's important to understand that there are many different types of attacks, some of which Dan referred to, whether or not they're business continuity attacks or denial of service, and all of these not only, hold that reputational risk, that damage to, how customers and consumers perceive you, but there's also a hard cost associated with it, both in terms of the dollars required to recover from the attack, and also what it may do to your share price if you're a public company.
Okay, good point. And so then moving on quickly, we've talked about headline and reputation risk. We're talking about the business damage that can happen, the financial impact, but then there's the legal consequences, right, Dan?
Very much so, absolutely, Neil. It's really important to focus on these issues because I think both on the private side, in terms of consumer litigation and class action litigation, the class action bar is becoming more and more familiar with these sorts of issues. They're becoming more and more aggressive in trying to press claims for damages on behalf of classes of affected consumers. So you have the private risk from private lawsuits, and at the same time, the government has made no secret of the fact that they are stepping up their enforcement actions in response to this sort of risk. So there are many examples in recent years of the Federal Trade Commission, the FTC, taking action against companies that it feels don't have adequate cyber protections in place. The SEC has indicated that it's going to be looking at its registrants and whether they have adequate security systems in place. And obviously, the Department of Justice and the criminal authorities are active in this area as well.
Okay, and then just to talk about some of the current developments here in terms of what's happening around legislation and regulation. Jeff, give us some of the highlights.
Well, I mean, I think that, what people can read here, what's on the slide, but I think that what's important in talking about is how, in the recent business climate, there's been a variety of legislation passed that holds companies, board members, executives accountable for certain types of behavior. This is also, being illustrated with these types of cyber regulations that are taking place, things that are, voted on in the House and will be voted on in the Senate, particularly the one related to improving critical infrastructure for cybersecurity. This is a top to bottom audit of the federal government's efforts to defend our nation's information and infrastructure. And I mean, this also, is going to lead to not only greater scrutiny, but also more of the type of liability that Dan's talking about.
Now, Dan, what's quite interesting here is that the SEC has addressed this, but in terms of the line, where a company must disclose its preparedness and where a company has to disclose an attack or an event, it's a very blurry line, right? There's no clear guidance.
I think that's absolutely right. The SEC has provided guidance in a very general way, but fundamentally it comes down to the basic responsibility that public companies have to disclose material events to the marketplace. I think what many companies are discovering is that many cyber incidents that occur are obviously going to be material events. And so there's, the general duty to disclose material events to the marketplace, coupled with SEC guidance saying that these are within the category of things that are material. On the other hand, companies very often are rightly concerned about the fact that if they were to disclose publicly details about an attack, it could compromise an ongoing law enforcement investigation. The SEC has acknowledged that providing that kind of information could end up being counterproductive in the sense that it would give a roadmap to the next wave of attackers, because they would see what one attacker did and be able to adjust their behavior in response. So companies are often faced with really conflicting demands. They have, on the one hand, a duty to disclose material events and disclose their governance. On the other hand, the very nature of the cyber threat is such that companies have a very real need to keep matters confidential if it's going to compromise an investigation or help educate bad actors.
What about even before any attack happens, the disclosure of a company's preparedness? Where do we stand with that? Are there clear guidelines or any rules around that?
Well, there's a couple of different considerations. Again, the SEC does not require a company to disclose things in such a way that would be counterproductive and give a roadmap to potential attackers. So I think corporate board members and management can take comfort in that regard. On the other hand, I think it's probably prudent for companies to, if they're not going to be able to disclose in detail what their preparedness plans are, or if they're not going to be able to disclose the details of an attack because of the concerns that we've talked about, then but they nevertheless need to show that they're aware of the issue, and on top of it, one thing to do is to disclose, in general terms, the governance structure around cyber issues, what their general state of preparedness is, in order to demonstrate to the market that they're aware of it. The final thought I'd mention, before we move on, though, is that in doing that, it's really critical that the disclosures are 100% accurate, because as the FTC versus Wyndham case, which is currently in the courts, demonstrates, Wyndham has come under scrutiny by federal regulators for what's alleged to be overstating their level of cyber preparedness. So it's important to make those general disclosures while balancing it against the need to not give too much information to the bad guys, and at the same time, always make sure that everything that you say is going to be completely accurate.
Okay, some great points there, Dan. Let's bring the audience in now and get some response here. We'll be very curious to hear some of the opinions here. So, with regard to your company's cybersecurity policies, here's our online poll. You are aware of them and involved in those policies, perhaps as a corporate secretary or general counsel, and neither aware nor involved. So we'd be curious to find out where we're at with this with the audience. Now, Dan, you said earlier that you believe that this is moving in the right direction, right? So we're not at a state of despair in terms of the preparedness of boards and those who support them, like corporate secretaries, right?
Well, I still think there's cause for alarm, but my point is that if you look at some of the data that was published even 2 or 3 years ago, the numbers of corporate board members who were aware of cybersecurity policies was shockingly low. And it seems that little by little, companies and their boards and management are heeding the call that's been made by regulators and by lawyers and by others, security experts, to take these issues seriously. And it sounds to me as if more and more companies and their boards are paying attention to these issues, and we certainly see that in our practice as more and more of our clients are being attentive to these issues.
Okay. Now, we may have rather a self-selecting group that have dialed in to listen. Of course, they have an interest already in this topic. But let's take a look at these results, and we can see that 2/3 are aware of their company's cybersecurity policies. Nearly 20% are aware of them and involved in those policies, which is a very good sign, I think. Just 20% of our listeners are neither aware nor involved in what their companies are doing. So not a bad state of affairs, and hopefully, as you say, Dan, improving. Let's go on to talking about the response then, the response plan. And we won't have time to go through these slides in detail, but I want to assure the audience that the deck will be made available. And I think these are a great resource. We have a couple of slides here that give you a kind of checklist. In fact, the next one is a checklist, right, Dan?
Yes. Yes. Well, look, I think one thing that we see when these cyber incidents occur is that those who are responsible for reacting to them are always going to be very pressed for time, because by the time the alarm gets triggered and the responsible managers are taking a look at what occurred, they're already behind the 8 ball. And so the more that can be done in advance to anticipate attacks and plan what's going to be done, the better off you're going to be. And so what we recommend is that you develop in advance an incident response plan that's detailed and provides real guidance to the folks who are going to be responding as to who needs to be notified and how the response is going to be carried out. It's important that companies analyze what insurance coverage exists and that they think about how they're going to communicate to the various different constituencies about what occurred, whether it's the public, customers, vendors, and regulators. There can be any number of constituents, and that all needs to be considered and coordinated. And then finally, I think it's really important, and the last point, obviously the slide is here with all the different considerations, but the one I'd emphasize is to think in advance about how the company is going to investigate what occurred. Because very often a mistake that we see companies make is they immediately turn to the same IT people who are responsible for managing systems on a day-to-day basis and ask them to investigate what occurred. And the problem there is that those people are often not thinking about things in a way that's designed to preserve evidence for future investigations or for future litigation. They often are focused on potentially pointing blame somewhere else if they feel rightly or wrongly that they may have be responsible for the attack that occurred. And so often I think it's helpful if a board or senior leadership can designate either a special committee of a board or some designated officer who's going to be responsible not for managing the IT systems on a daily basis, but for planning and executing a proper investigation after an incident occurs.
That's excellent advice. So get ready for the investigation well before any attack even happens. A couple other good points on this slide that you don't often see mentioned, of course, the crisis communications ones, the having your team ready to go, those are pretty standard, but things like security audits of key vendors, so taking care of your supply chain, and, of course, as we were talking about before, litigation and regulatory preparedness. And our next slide really reflects that preceding list, but as in a sort of checklist form. So we'll leave that as a resource from the audience. Let's get another temperature check from the audience and find out at board level, amongst our companies listening, who is responsible for cybersecurity. So at board level, if anybody, is someone responsible for cybersecurity. Now, I know, Dan, you have made a strong recommendation that in financial institutions, there should be a dedicated committee. Is that right?
Ideally, I mean, it's not one size fits all, and every company is different. But this is an issue that regulators and potential class action plaintiffs are going to be looking at what your preparedness was. And if you can demonstrate that we had a dedicated committee of the board that was analyzing the latest threats and was analyzing our preparedness, our view is that's going to put you in the best possible position to overcome claims that might be made that the company wasn't taking these obligations seriously. The board ultimately is going to have a responsibility as under their duty of care for the corporation to demonstrate that they're taking the risk seriously. And one very good way to be able to demonstrate that the board has taken that seriously is to say that we have a dedicated group of board members, a committee that is focused on this issue on a regular basis.
Okay, well, let's take a look at the results from our audience. And looks pretty good, actually. 60% audit committee is handling it, which I think is fairly standard for many corporations. At 8% of companies, a director with technology experience, one director with technology experience is taking it on as a responsibility. Dedicated committee of the board at 11% of companies, and 15% the CEO is handling it. So would you say, Dan, that's probably a pretty good cross-section, a bit of a snapshot of corporate America as it stands? I think the audit committee?
I think it is, especially a lot of audit committees are broadly audit and risk committees, and this is certainly a category of risk that should be evaluated alongside all the other risks.
Okay. Well, let's get into the heart of it now and a little bit more from Jeff on how the board views these things. Just quickly, Jeff, anything to add on what Dan was saying about how the board should be tackling cybersecurity in general overall?
Yes, Neil. Certainly Dan makes some excellent points and is certainly accurate in talking about committees or assigned groups dealing with cybersecurity. But I think it is important to understand that it's the responsibility of all of the board members and everyone involved at a senior level to be aware of these policies and maybe to not be proactively involved with them on a daily basis, but certainly to be involved with them. I mean, I agree with the poll results that the numbers are trending in a better direction, but I think that, you could take some concern at almost a fifth of the poll respondents not being aware or involved with their cybersecurity policies. This is a topic that, of course, we get asked about a great deal, and a lot of board members feel somewhat overwhelmed by it, that how could they be expected to be cybersecurity experts? And of course, they don't have to be cybersecurity experts. They just have to know the importance of it to their company. In order to combat all of the various threats, it's really something that involves every member of an organization, and that starts at the top. So the board really has to be involved with understanding the importance of taking a stand and a proactive initiative about cybersecurity. It's not just the domain of the CTO. It's not something that just falls in the IT department. It's also not something that's just necessarily going to fall within the budget of those various groups. The board has to be responsible for being involved in setting policies, follow-up, understanding what these procedures are, and also being very active, as Dan was talking about, in how they're going to respond to a breach, respond to an attack. So it's really a process of everyone on a board understanding this is important, designating the appropriate people and resources, and then following through on a regular basis.
Good, okay, and this slide is a good high-level guide to how a board can be addressing this through a number of different ways. So while we were previously talking about how a company can respond, how to prepare, this is really at the board level. Now, let's go on. We want to talk specifically about a board's own security. So in terms of a board's communications, its meeting materials, all that a board does, whether it's in the boardroom or communications between directors, let's talk about a board's own cybersecurity, Jeff.
So thanks, Neil. I mean, of course, at Diligent Board Books, we provide the world's leading secure board portal for companies to communicate securely with the highest level members of their organization, board members and executives. And the board portals were really initially designed to replace the very manual and certainly not secure way of distributing materials via paper. But what people may not always understand is that you could be doing some type of electronic distribution information, and it's really not safe. If you're emailing documents or slapping them as PDFs into, some type of account, whether external or internal, and people accessing them, these are not secure ways of distributing your materials. When you're communicating with your board, you want to have the ability to communicate with them in real time in a highly secure way, no matter where the board members might be. So, obviously with, a system like Diligent Board Books, we're talking about a company being able to reach board members in real time, give them individual secure access to materials, real-time updates of those materials, and also being able to communicate with the board members and the board members being able to communicate with each other in a way that's highly secure, but also from a regulatory, a legal compliance standpoint is not going to create any additional issues as well. So, it's very important to have this very tight control of the materials that you're rolling out, to be able to produce things even down to an individual document level to individual users, having the ability to control that material, pull it back if necessary, update it in real time, give the board members the ability to access these materials from anywhere in the world off of any device that they want. All of this, secure, isolated, contained communication with your board is an important part of the process, not only of communicating with them on an ongoing basis, but also in times of emergency.
Now, a lot of our listeners are probably already users of a board portal. The key thing here, I think, on this slide to look at is whether or not they are, whether they're still using hard copy or they're using email or whatever means they're using. Some of those concerns you have to think about, whether it's privacy, administrator control, and access. These are common across any platform. To focus, especially on board portals, one of the things is that if you're using a portal, you need to know what the security measures are, and you need to avail yourself of them, right? What are some of the key things that you have to make sure that you're aware of and using, Jeff?
Well, I think some of the key things is that you have to make sure that your data is absolutely secure. For a board portal to function really well, it needs to give the board members the ability to access the materials both online and also offline when they're not connected to the Internet. And this needs to be done in a secure, encrypted way so that those materials are still only accessible to the individual user. That's one of the important things. And then the other thing is, there are two other things, one of which is what are the tests, what is the performance of the board portal? What is the documentation? What is the history of that particular provider that they're providing a tested, safe solution, and that's always available to your users? And then also, what does it mean in terms of the exposure of the board members? The idea of a highly secure electronic portal is that it's also not going to create any liability or discoverability issues for the board members. It's not going to track their usage. It's not going to leave any record of their communication. These are really the important security areas that you want to function on. It's not just the control of the data, but it's also, when the data is accessed, what does that mean? What does it mean to the end users from a security standpoint?
So it's interesting the way you look at it. This really, it's a couple of different levels. On the one hand, it's protecting the communications of the company, but it's also protecting the access and the communications of the individual board members. So you really have to look at it in two levels. Well, let's find out about where our audience is at in terms of distributing board materials, and just ask a very simple question, and that is, what is your primary method for distributing board materials? And Jeff, overall, do we know in terms of public company boards in the U.S., what is the rate of adoption of secure portals?
Well, there's different figures that you see. For public companies, in terms of using board portals, it may be as high as 50% overall. Certainly, the bigger an organization, the more likely they are to be using a board portal. In that, the Fortune 1000 is estimated to be about 70% of them are using board portals. And then that, becomes lower numbers going down the scale. But certainly, you can be confident that it is now the standard practice for public companies.
Okay, well, let's take a look at what our audience does. And here we have the results. The portal is about two-thirds of companies, 64% of companies are using a portal. Those are people listening. A quarter, 25%, are using email. Hard copy, just 10% still. No one is using the cloud, so no one is using Dropbox, which I think is perhaps a relief to the general counsels out there. And just, finally, for those of our audience that have not adopted a board portal and perhaps thinking about it, and just in terms of looking at a vendor, you mentioned a little bit of this before, Jeff. What are some of the questions that you need to ask?
Well, you just need to make sure that, the board portal provider, the security, the access to controls, the security incident response features of the system are going to match up with your organization's process. I mean, you want a system that's going to be able to pass your own internal security standards, of course, and also is going to be able to meld with, not only the needs of your users, but pass the scrutiny of your own IT department, your own risk assessment people, and of course, you also need to, be sure that you're working with a vendor who's always going to be responsive to your needs and is going to be responding to you as they need to. I mean, we, of course, also are a public company, so we face a lot of these types of disclosure things, but also have written into all of our contracts, speedy and timely notification, if there were ever to be an incident to our clients. These are important parts of the system because there's a lot of organizations that may be claiming to provide secure storage and distribution of your materials, but there's actually a very small number who are going to be able to do that in a truly secure way in the modern sense and also meet all of the regulatory requirements that, a public company is certainly going to have.
Okay. Thanks, Jeff. And just to wrap things up, Dan, maybe you could bring us around full circle and help us come to a close. We talked about the level of risk, the kind of alert level. We've been talking about how companies can prepare. You've said that we're moving in the right direction. What is the outlook for corporate America? Are things going to stay on an even keel? Is there the possibility of kind of cyber Armageddon? Is there reason to be optimistic?
Well, I think programs like today are some reason to be optimistic because there are many companies are paying attention to this issue and are trying to get up to speed as quickly as they can. I think as long as people are focused on the issue and are prepared, there's reason to think that the worst effects can be at least mitigated.
Okay, good. Thanks, Dan. And just, Jeff, there is a key question from the audience, actually a few different questions, and it's about authentication. In this company, the information security team requires what's called true two-factor authentication. This listener is wondering whether any board portals have that type of authentication. What are some of the things that portals do to hack-proof their systems, and any recent developments or mishaps with hard copies that might avert companies from that?
Well, taking that from the end of it first, I mean that's always been one of the entertaining things for us. What happens with people's hard copies? FedEx packages that don't get delivered, board members who say they're going to be in one place and they're not, and a set of materials is left on a doorstep or something like that, or board members who leave their board books in the back of taxi cabs or in hotel rooms or carelessly discard it in some trash can someplace. I mean, I think the tales of what happens with hard copy are legion, and that, it may not have been intuitively obvious to people that distributing materials electronically is more secure than hard copy, but it is. I mean, in a system like ours, you've got a tighter control of your documents electronically, always highly encrypted, always at your control than you do with hard copy materials. I mean, also a system like ours, Diligent Board Books, yes, we do have that two-factor authentication, which is, of course, the combination of when a user is logging into the system of something that they know, i.e. username, password, security questions, and something that they have, which is, either a physical token or a virtual token, which is information that's going to have to be plugged in to that device at that moment when they access it. So, I mean, for us, this is all part of mobility partnerships, and is also an important part of the system because, let's face it, there's really not too much of an emphasis that you can place on security when distributing and accessing board materials. Okay, well, Jeff Powell from Diligent Board Member Services, thank you very much, and Dan Stein from Richards, Kibbe, and Orby. It's been a pleasure talking to you, and really appreciate some excellent advice there for boards and their corporate secretaries, general counsels, not only sort of enterprise-level cybersecurity, but also a board's own cybersecurity. Gentlemen, thank you very much, and to our audience, thanks for listening in and for your questions and for answering our polling questions as well. This is Neil Stewart for Corporate Secretary. Goodbye.